Welcome everybody to Maine's Raptors. We'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes. We're just gonna wait just a couple more minutes while people sign in, but please feel free to use the chat features if you wanna ask us something or you have something to say about this. We'll be starting in about 2 minutes. Welcome everybody to Maine's Raptors. We're going to get started now. Just a reminder, you can use the chat features if you want. We're now going to go down to Jade, who is at Maine Wildlife Park in Gray.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jade, and I'm an educator for the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. And today we are at the Maine Wildlife Park in Gray, Maine, which is part of the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife here in Maine. And at the park, we have a lot of types of Maine native wildlife. So everything from moose to black bears, different raptors, snakes, turtles, bobcats, beavers, and a lot more. And all the animals that are here are because they can no longer live in the wild. They are all non-releasable, and that can be from being orphaned, injured, or human dependent. In some cases, they were even illegal pets. But none of them here can live in the wild on their own. So if you want to learn more about the park, you can go to mainewildlifepark.com. And today our focus is on Maine's raptors. There are a lot of different types of birds in Maine, and raptors are one of the most popular to view. They are known as birds of prey as well as raptors, and they eat meat by hunting other animals. And here in Maine, there are lots of different types of raptors. We have falcons, eagles, vultures, hawks, and owls. And there's some different characteristics that all raptors have in common. Today we'll talk about some of Maine's specific species, but in general, all raptors do hunt and are carnivores. So even vultures, who usually eat, they are scavengers, so they eat food that is already dead. So they eat animals that they haven't had to hunt live. And other raptors will scavenge sometimes too when their live options are scarce. But all raptors do eat meat. They are carnivores. And they all have some specific adaptations too. So all raptors have these hooked, very sharp beaks. Put this in front of my shirt so we can kind of see it a little bit better. So this is an osprey, and we can see this very sharp hooked beak. And that is for ripping into their prey and eating their prey. But they also have to be gentle enough that they can still groom and preen their feathers. So special beaks for hunting and eating meat, but they can't be so sharp that they can't maintain and care for their feathers also. Another thing we can see on this osprey are these talons. So all raptors have these sharp talons, and they're very large and they're hooked. And they have muscles that control these talons, these muscles in their legs. And it will help them rip off pieces to eat and perch. And those muscles are like a vice grip. So they can tighten really hard when they are carrying and eating their prey and holding on to their perches. Another characteristic that all raptors have is keen eyesight. So this is a great horned owl mount. And when we look at these eyes, we can see that they're front facing. So raptors have binocular vision. So they have two eyes that face forward. And this is very common in predators. And their eyesight helps them locate different prey. And depending on different raptors, their eyesight is different for where they hunt, how they hunt, and what time of day they hunt. And we can also, when we look at the whole body, we can see these wings. So raptors have wings that are large, and the shape of them are specialized for different hunting strategies. So we'll talk about some of these different adaptations specifically with different species also. And another thing about raptors is that the females of the species are usually larger than the males. So when we look at mammals or other groups of animals, a lot of times the females are smaller than the males in the species. But with raptors, the females are usually the larger of the two. And each bird of prey is specially designed to hunt in different ways, different habitats, and different times of day. And this helps to limit competition. So if all the birds were trying to hunt in the same way, at the same time, in the same place, we couldn't have this diverse range of different species because they would just constantly be competing for the exact same food. So we'll see how these different raptors get around that so they aren't competing in the same space for the same food. And there are more than 20 species of raptors that are native to Maine. And there are many different species of hawks, owls, and falcons. There are a couple different eagles and vultures also. And for many species, Maine is an important breeding space for a lot of these different species. The first birds that we'll talk about are the eagles. And these are some of our favorites to watch soar with their very strong wings on air currents. And we're lucky in Maine that sometimes we actually see two species. The most common is the bald eagle, but oftentimes we mistake young bald eagles for golden eagles. So there are about 2,000 bald eagles found across the state each year, but there are fewer than 100 golden eagles. So the golden eagles are endangered in Maine, and both of these species are protected by federal law. And as an adult, I'm gonna grab this bald eagle mount here. Scoot the osprey out of the way. All right, there we go. So they have this very recognizable white head, and it's not truly bald. They actually have feathers covering their head, but because they're white, they get that name, the bald eagle. And then they're dark bodies. And they don't get this white head until they're actually around 4 or 5 years old. So when they're young, before they get that white head, their head is brown. And that's why they often are mistaken for golden eagles, because golden eagles have brown heads and bodies. So when they are getting to be kind of closer to 4 or 5 years old, they'll slowly, gradually change to have that white head. And these are very large birds. They will be about 3 feet tall, and they can have a wingspan that's over 6 feet long. So most of them, their wingspan is anywhere between 6 and 6.5 feet. So very, very wide wingspan that's taller than I am, with their wings across. And they're very majestic to watch. They eat fish, so they hunt for fish, and they will also hunt for different mammals or sometimes even waterfowl. But most commonly, you'll see them around bodies of water, soaring over the water looking for fish. And these birds build very large nests. They build their nests high off the ground. And I'm gonna move this out of the way. So in this eagle enclosure behind me, if you look in the kind of sun area, that is the makeshift nest for the eagle that's here. But it can give you an idea of the size of an eagle nest. So some eagle nests have been known to weigh more than a metric ton. Some have even weighed closer to 2 metric tons. So they're very, very large and hold their babies. And they make them very high off the ground too, usually up in the highest trees, and sometimes up on different like light posts and the power lines too. And the call that they make is different than the movies portray. Most of the time in movies, we hear a red tailhawk call, but eagles make a cackling, almost like a seagull sound. So we have an example here if you want to listen to this eagle call. So you can hear it sounds kind of more like you'd imagine a seagull sounding, whereas a lot of the times when we see the eagles in movies and on TV, it's this very loud, high pitch, even scream, and that is actually usually a red tail hawk call. The next animal that we'll talk about are the osprey. And osprey are also known as fish hawks. And these birds are often mistaken for eagles because they have very similar behaviors, habitats, and diets, but they do look very different. So the osprey are excellent anglers. Different studies have shown that they have over a 70% success rate in catching fish. And on average, it takes them about 12 minutes from leaving their nest to actually make a catch. So very, very good fishing birds. They have these barbed, very rough pads on the soles of their feet, and that helps them grab onto those slippery fish. And they actually carry the fish head first. So you can see in this picture of the osprey flying, they carry the fish head first, and that makes it so that there's actually less wind resistance than trying to carry the fish like sideways. So very, very smart adaptation there. I'm gonna grab this osprey mount again. So osprey are very abundant in Maine, but they aren't as lucky in some other states. So in other states, they are listed as endangered or threatened, but thankfully in Maine, they are not listed. Maine is a very important breeding territory for these birds. And again, we can see that very sharp hooked raptor beak. Again, this is a mount, so these eyes are not real, they're glass eyes, but it still gives a good example of how bright and large those predator eyes are for soaring up above the water and seeing the fish under the water. And then I can get close and see these talons and feet for grabbing onto those slippery fish. Then we'll talk about vultures. And there are 2 species of vultures found in Maine. Turkey vultures have become very widespread, and black vultures are much less common. Vultures have a very good sense of smell in addition to their other raptor features. So you can see they have very large like scent canals there on their face for smelling very well. And turkey vultures are mostly here in the warmer months, and then they go south for the winter. They have adapted their featherless, bald faces and heads because of their diet. Again, they do scavenge from dead animals, which is kind of yucky for us to think about. But they do have to groom themselves less and maintain those head feathers less because they get really dirty eating those dead animals. And a fun fact is that when a vulture feels threatened, they will sometimes vomit on their attacker. So they're gonna bring back up that yucky meal that they just ate, and that's a very good defense mechanism. So they'll vomit on that attacker, and they'll actually do that same thing on themselves. So when it's very hot and their feet on their skin gets really, really hot in the sun, they'll actually vomit on their own feet to cool down. So kind of gross, but very good adaptations for the way that they live. Next, we'll look at some hawks. So there are two different groups of hawks. They're the butios and the accipiters. And the butios, like the red-tailed hawks, have larger bodies and very long, broad wings. And the accipiters, like the sharp-shinned hawk, have shorter wings that are still broad and longer tails. The first one we'll look at is the red-tailed hawk. And this is the most common hawk in Maine, and it's the most common hawk throughout North America. They're often seen along roadways hunting and soaring up in the sky. And it's easier to identify these hawks because they have that rusty red tail that you can see most of the time. And we also have a red tail hawk call. I mentioned before how this is often used in different movies and films. So we'll listen now to that red tail hawk call. So it's that very high pitched, kind of even, long scream. And that's what we kind of think of as most raptors sounding like. But raptors actually have very diverse calls, and they all sound different from each other. But again, because of film, different movies and TV, using that same call for a lot of different raptors that are depicted in those movies and everything, we think that a lot of raptors sound like the red-tailed hawk. And they've been seen hunting in pairs. They have a diverse diet that has small mammals, and the pair will actually sit on opposite sides of a tree so that they can have an optimal chance at finding their lunch. So one will sit on one side of the tree and the other will sit on the other side, so they can have almost a 360 degree view of the ground around them to find their small mammals to grab. And they have a very interesting courtship too. So they do these wild flights with very steep dives and different acrobatics. And the pair will actually clasp their talons together in the air and then spiral towards the ground. And they separate, obviously, before hitting the ground. But it's very interesting if you ever get to catch this wild courtship display. The next hawk that we'll look at are the broadwing hawks. And this is a smaller of the same group of hawks as the red-tailed hawk. And they live in different forest areas and are often heard before they are seen because they have a very sharp call, and we'll play that call also. So again, it's very high pitched and it's kind of a two-part whistle, but very high pitched. So you'll hear that more before you see them because they do live in kind of denser forests. And they're here in Maine for their nesting season. The broadwing hawks will migrate and are, when they do these migrations, it's very, very magnificent to watch. They will migrate in the hundreds of thousands when they leave their northern forests for South America. And these flocks of hawks are called kettles. So people, birders and bird watchers will try and go watch these very grand migrations of the broadwing hawks. And there are many places around Maine that you can see them migrate in early and mid-spring, coming up from those warmer places where they were before. The next hawk that we'll look at is the northern harrier. And this bird is a bird, their species is a special concern in Maine, so their populations are falling. And they stand out from other hawks. They have this owl-like face, and that is for hearing small rodents running on the ground. These hawks actually soar very close to the ground, much closer to the ground than a lot of other raptors do. And they're often seen flying very low, just above grass height, with their wings spread out in this V shape. And they have a little white patch on their rump. You can tell that is a northern harrier from that white patch. And also, unlike many other hawks, they nest on the ground, and they often nest in colonies. So there will be multiple northern harrier groups nesting all together. And with these raptors, the males will have many mates. So a lot of other raptors that actually keep the same mate for life, these are different in that way too. So the male will provide food to all the different female mates while the female incubates the eggs on the nest. And the last hawk that we'll look at is the sharp-shinned hawk. And this is the smallest of Maine's hawks. I have a sharp-shinned hawk mount here. So much smaller than a lot of the other hawks, but it is one of the fastest. So this is one of those accipiter hawks. And they have very interesting proportions. So they have these very long legs and shorter wings and this long tail. And this gives them a lot of control of their flight. So these birds are very acrobatic flyers, and they're sometimes even mistaken for falcons. So falcons are the fastest flyers, and even though these are hawks, because they have such flight control and fly at such high speeds, they're often mistaken for falcons. And along with the eagles, so when those DDT pesticides are being used, it really hurt the sharp-shinned hawk populations like it hurt the eagle populations. And now that those pesticides have been banned, these birds, like the eagles, are starting to make a comeback. So very resilient birds. And they eat other small birds. And unlike some of the owls that eat birds, they actually pluck the feathers from their prey before they eat them. So they don't swallow the feathers like owls often do. The next group that we'll talk about are falcons. So like I said before, these falcons, they are the fastest flyers of all the raptors. The peregrine falcon is the fastest animal ever recorded, and falcons use their speed to catch and kill their prey. The center picture here is of a kestrel. So kestrels are also known as sparrowhawks. So even though they are a falcon, people call them sparrowhawks. And they are the smallest falcon in North America. They have a lot of fight in that little body though. So kestrels hunt smaller animals and insects, but when they do catch something bigger than something that they can eat in one sitting, they'll actually take that surplus food and they'll hide it in grasses, trees, and even in fence posts to save for later. And these kestrels are often seen along farm fields, and you'll see them perched on wires and fences near fields. Next one that we'll talk about is the peregrine falcon. These falcons are endangered here in Maine. I have a peregrine falcon mount here. So this is a juvenile peregrine falcon. And these birds are the fastest flyers. So they will also eat other flying birds, and they do that by soaring up above them, and then they drop down on them from above like a sneak attack. So when they're flying in a straight line after another bird, they can fly more than 60 miles per hour. But when they do that dive bomb behavior, from above, they'll actually reach more than 200 miles per hour. So these birds are the fastest recorded flyers ever. And I think it was over 240 miles per hour. That was the fastest falcon dive bomb that's ever been recorded. And they live in many different habitats around the world. They're found on every continent except Antarctica. And they nest on cliffs and tall buildings. So again, this is a species that's endangered here in Maine. Very, very cool birds. The last group of birds that we'll talk about are owls. So most of the owls in Maine are nocturnal. That means that they are active at night, or they're crepuscular, and this means that they're active during dusk and dawn. And owls have adapted this very, very quiet flight. It's so quiet that it's almost silent. And they also have a very keen sense of sight, like other raptors, as well as very keen hearing, which helps them, especially since most of them are nocturnal and they're hunting and looking for prey in very low light conditions. The first one we'll look at is the great horned owl. So get this great horned owl mount out again. So they get their name from these long tufts on the top of their head, those feathers on the top, and they're found throughout North America in a variety of different habitats. So they'll live in forests, wetlands, deserts, cities, really any kind of semi-open habitat the great horned owls are adapted for living in. And they can take down prey larger than themselves. They've also preyed on raptors larger than themselves, such as Osprey, other falcons, and sometimes they actually eat other owls. And most often they're going to eat rodents and other small animals, including skunks. This is one of the bigger like predators of skunks. And they have eyes that are adapted for excellent night vision. They're very large, but these eyes actually cannot move in the eye socket. So they have this adaptation that they can actually swivel their heads around more than 180 degrees. And they swivel those heads around because unlike us, they can't move their eyes to look like side to side and up and down. So they actually use their entire head to swivel and look around for prey. And sometimes you can hear these owls at night. So especially in the winter and fall, it sounds like a very deep voice saying, "Who's awake? Me too. Who's awake?" So we'll play that call now. So that was the great horned owl call. Another owl that we have here in Maine is the barred owl. And these owls are often seen during the day perched in trees. So they're not very active during the day, but you will see them resting and hanging out up in the trees. And they have brown stripes on them and little bars and very dark eyes. And young barred owls, like other owlets, will climb up trees by holding on to the bark of the tree with their beaks and their talons, and then they flap their wings for momentum, and they sort of walk up the side of the tree that way, using their beaks, talons, and flapping their wings around. And this is a fluffy barred owlet pictured there. And the barred owl call are said to sound like, "Who cooks for you?" So it sounds like a "who cooks for you, who cooks for you all." And we'll play that call now too. So that was the barred owl. Then one of the smaller owls here in Maine is the eastern screech. And this owl is again listed as special concern, so their populations are hurting a little bit. They are a very small owl species. They're usually only between 6 and 10 inches tall, and they have very, very good camouflaged plumage for blending into trees. They're more often the gray color but they also have this red morph that's possible. And we estimate that about 1 out of every 3 are that red color, with the rest of them being the gray morph color. And they are very good insect eaters, and they'll also eat small rodents, frogs, and snakes. They nest in tree cavities and sometimes even use nesting boxes if it's in a suitable habitat. And they have an interesting call too. Their call sounds like a ghost horse, and we'll play that call now. So again, we're hearing that all these different owls have very, very diverse different calls. So they don't all just have that kind of hooing sound, but they vary and they're different between each species. Another species here in Maine is the barn owl, not to be confused with the barred owl, but this is the barn owl. And they are also listed as special concern here in Maine. They have very keen eyesight, especially while they're hunting at night. So these barn owls' ability to catch prey by hearing is the best of any animal that has ever been tested. So even though they have that very keen eyesight like all the other raptors, their sense of hearing is better than the other raptors. They are really good at hearing animals that are in very, very deep grass and also deep snow. So that facial disc that's around the owl's face, the way that their feathers grow, helps actually direct sound towards their ears also. So when we see those owls with that facial kind of disc circle around them, it's to help with their sense of hearing. And even though these owls do have populations all around the world, they are declining in certain areas due to habitat loss. So they hunt in very large open meadows and fields. So as they're losing those meadows and fields here in Maine, they're losing their habitat. So that's why they're listed as special concern. And they often like to nest in old barns and hollow trees. And these small white owls have a loud, piercing screech that we'll play for you all now. So very, very different from the other owls that we heard. So again, not owls make that hooting noise. The barn owl actually sounds more like a red-tailed hawk than it does some of the other owls. So a lot of diversity between their different calls. So next we're going to look at this interesting thing. And I want to know if you know what this is. It is not a hairball. This is actually called a pellet. They're also called castings. And it does come out of raptors. It's not puke and it's not poop. This is actually the different parts of the animals that they've eaten, like the fur, the feathers, the bones, that they can't digest. So their stomach acid is not strong enough to break it down. And they actually cough up these pellets a few hours after finishing their meal. And you can actually dissect these pellets. So if you're walking through the woods and you find one of these pellets, you can actually bring it home and dissect it to find different skeletons and find kind of what that last meal was. But you do need to be very careful. So you definitely want to wear some gloves. And these pellets can have different like bacteria and germs on them. So just make sure that you're being really safe when you're handling these. But it's a really fun activity to discover what the raptor's last meal was. So we've learned about a lot of different raptors in Maine. We've seen their unique adaptations. Some of those adaptations are physical adaptations and others are behavioral adaptations, but they all make them top-notch predators. And it shows how they're a very important part in any ecosystem. So these raptors are very important here in Maine and amazing predators for hunting their prey. And I'd love to answer a few questions if we have any questions that came in. And then I will try and get us a little bit closer to the eagles too, so we can get a closer look at the eagles after I answer some questions.
Yes, we do have a few questions, but now is the time to use the chat function if you do have some more questions to ask us. But one question that we have is, do all owls have non-movable eye sockets? So do their eyes not roll on all owls?
Yeah, so due to the shape of their actual like skeletal structure, due to their anatomy and the way that their bodies are, they cannot move their eyes in their head. So their eyes are locked in the same place, and that's why they have that adaptation of actually moving their heads all the way around. So they cannot circle their head in a full rotation, like they can't go 360 degrees, but they can look all the way back over their backs, which is further than we can move our eyes on our own. So all owls have that locked eye position and keen eyesight, but they have to swivel their heads and necks to look around their surroundings.
Another question is, do all raptors eat mice?
No, not all raptors eat mice. So there's some raptors that their diet consists a lot more of fish. So like our osprey, they're going to be living close to water, and they're going to have a diet that is mostly fish. They are going to be opportunistic hunters. So like I said, even the birds that we don't refer to as a scavenger, like vultures, if they are really desperate and if they're having trouble finding live food, they might branch out from their normal diet to eat something else. So occasionally a raptor that does usually eat fish might go and catch a mouse and eat that. But again, depending on their different adaptations and habitats, not all raptors are going to be primarily eating rodents or mice.
Another question was, do any raptors take over any vacated nests from other raptors?
Yeah, that actually happens a lot. So, especially when those young flighted birds will leave their parents' nest in search of another nest, it is easier if they found something that is abandoned and that has already been built. And even if it's kind of falling apart a little bit, it's easier for them to just kind of rebuild and reconfigure a nest that they've found than to start over from scratch. So sometimes they will start over and they'll find a new territory of their own. But if they find an abandoned nest, they'll definitely move into that nest instead.
And do owls take baths?
Yeah, so I talked about their beaks being very sharp for eating different prey and for catching prey and for ripping that prey apart. But they also use those beaks for preening. So birds kind of use their beaks to keep all their feathers in place and to maintain their feathers and their shape. So it's very important for birds, for their flight and their health, to have their feathers working properly. So they'll use their own beaks to kind of give themselves like a dry bath. But birds will also go and fly into the water to cool off and to like wet themselves. So especially on a hot day like today, might see some birds like going closer to the water. It's cooler at the water. So it's less, I think, for cleaning themselves because they do that a lot with like their beaks, but it's going to help them cool off by the water and to be near the water. And the birds that do fish, like the osprey, they dive bomb and actually hit the water with their bodies. So they definitely can get wet, and their feathers and everything will dry off, and they can get wet and then dry off again.
And another question is, where are a lot of these raptors who are migrating into Maine coming from?
So it's different for different species. Some might migrate just into more southern states within the US. Some of them will go up as far as like Maine, Canada, and even further north for their different spring and summer homes. But then they might go as far south into South America. So some of these birds are going to be going out of North America and all the way down to South America for their warm winter habitats.
And we had a question about falcon eggs. about how many eggs would, say, a peregrine falcon lay in their nest?
I'm not sure specifically about peregrine falcons. I know that most of the raptors are only going to have maybe 2 or 3 eggs at a time. They do have larger eggs and larger babies, so they have to use a lot of their like body heat and resources to incubate and care for those eggs. So they don't have a whole bunch of eggs. Most birds only lay 1 to 3 eggs at a time, but I don't know about peregrines specifically. I would assume that like most birds, they'd only lay one or 2 eggs.
Yeah, we did a quick little research here, and it seems they lay about 3 to 4 eggs in their nest at a time. So helps to make sure you at least have a couple survive and fly off. Another question is, when an osprey is catching the many different types of fish, do they kind of go in the water when they catch the fish?
Yeah, so I actually watched this yesterday. I was in a cove kind of off of Casco Bay down in Portland, and I watched an osprey hunting. And they fly in circles up high above the water with their gaze down. So they're gliding with their wings out and they stare down at the water and they can actually see the movement of fish underneath the water. So when they spot that fish, that's when they tuck in and they dive their bodies very fast down at the water and they actually scoop down into the water with their talons to grab that fish. So even if the fish is not at the water surface, the bird can see it and will grab it below the water surface deeper into the water and then fly back up with it.
That's great. And another question for a bird that maybe doesn't spend as much time in water is, how come we don't hear an owl when it's flying?
Yeah, so I'll grab this great horned owl mount again. And we can see they have sort of fluffy, like kind of lighter feathers. So unlike some of the like eagles that you might hear them kind of taking off and things like that a little bit more and flapping their wings, owls have adapted much lighter, small feathers that have less air resistance. So we don't hear them as well because of those evolved and adapted feathers that make it so they can fly almost silently. So they have different feathers than some of the other birds that you hear flapping. And that again is going to help because it's the sound of the air against their feathers. So their feathers don't have that same air hitting off of them because of their design.
And another question is, do raptors drink a lot of water in the wild?
Yeah, so just like a lot of other animals, they do need water to survive. And they're not necessarily getting that from their diet. They're not eating plants and things that have a lot of water in them. So the body of an animal that they're going to eat is going to have a little bit of water in it, but they still need to drink water. So even the animals that live further away from the water, they have to go to the water to get food, to get to stay hydrated and to drink. So they still do drink water just like a lot of other animals to stay healthy.
Yeah, that's great. And another question is, do osprey like to eat catfish and pike? Would they eat those specific fish?
I'm not sure about catfish. I know they definitely eat pike because we have here in Maine and we have lots of pike in our different lakes. I don't know about catfish specifically. I know that they do have a very fish-rich diet, so I don't think that they're being too picky about what fish they are going to be eating. But I don't know about like what individual specific species, but they're gonna eat a lot of different types of fish.
Yeah, I think it's more which ones they can see close enough to the surface of the water to be able to reach and grab. So they're not too picky on the type. And we did have one person who was curious if raptors would sometimes prey on small domestic animals that might be out in the yards on their own, like, a small pet.
Yeah, so a lot of these, especially the larger raptors, that do eat small mammals, just like the osprey are not going to be too picky about what different type of fish they're going to be eating. Those animals that eat the small mammals aren't going to be too picky about what small mammal they're eating. So just like a great horned owl might grab a skunk, a great horned owl might also grab a domesticated cat or possibly maybe a small dog. But I know that people's outdoor cats do sometimes fall victim to these raptors. So it's another reason to be very careful about keeping an eye on your pets, especially if you live out in an area where you have seen owls or raptors out and about. You want to keep an eye on them so that they don't get scooped up by one of these predators, one of these birds of prey.
And do raptors only eat meat?
Yes, so that's one of the defining characteristics that makes a raptor, is that they are carnivores. So these animals are adapted for eating meat, for catching prey and eating that prey. So they are not going to be eating plants. And you have to say most of the time or almost always. I mean, there's always going to be a chance that they accidentally eat a plant, but they're not purposely going out and foraging and seeking different plants or fruits or anything. These birds are going to be mostly eating other animals.
Yes, and our raptors are fairly true carnivores, considering they're targeting specific things to hunt. It'd be pretty unlikely unless that mouse just ate some grass in its belly. So that is it for our questions. But if you have any other questions that you'd like to ask us or send in, oh, oops, someone just typed one actually. Do raptors ever go after ducks?
Yeah, so some of the raptors that will be hunting around the water will also grab other waterfowl. So it can be ducks. There have even been cases of different eagles or osprey trying to grab like the young loons or like these baby ducks and baby loons and things. Loons are very, very protective, so the loons are going to fight very aggressively and protect their babies. But animals that are less of a predator, like a loon is a predator, will fall victim to raptors as well. So different ducks, especially their young ducks that are a little bit more vulnerable, are very easy prey for these raptors.
All right, I think that's all of our questions now. So thank you everybody for your questions, and please feel free to email us if you have more later.
Yeah, those were really good questions. I am going to grab the phone and I'm going to try and get a little bit closer. The golden eagle is over on this side of me that has not been behind me during this video. So I'm going to move us a little bit so that we can see the golden eagle that is here. Sorry, there's a bit of a glare on the glass, but hopefully you can see her. Both the eagles that are here at the park are females. So this is the female golden eagle. Oh, she's gonna move, show us those big wings. So both the eagles that are here at the park are missing part of one of their wings. So they can no longer soar like eagles need to hunt and survive, but they can hop. So we have these different perches and branches all around their exhibit so that they can still hop from place to place and move around. And then we'll go over here to the bald eagle. And she's also a female. Can you see her, Laura?
Yes, we can see her a little bit. There's a little bit of a glare around her, so it's a little tough. Since Jade works there, she can get us a little better look.
Yeah. So that again is another female, and you can see very different. She has that, they're both mature. So she has that white bald eagle head. Another thing when they're adults is their beaks. So this bald eagle, she has a yellow beak sitting there nicely. She's waiting for her lunch. And then over here at the golden eagle, they have a brown beak. So that's another thing if you're trying to distinguish, especially from pictures, you can tell the golden eagle compared to the bald eagle. All right. Back up here. There we go. So thank you all again for joining us. I hope you had fun and learned something new about Maine's raptors. You can go to the mefishwildlife.com to see other virtual tours and the recordings from previous virtual tours. And we also have different resources on that site of different things you can do from home, different activities and other learning resources as well. So thank you all and have a good day.
Thank you everybody for joining us for Raptors in Maine. Please be sure to check out mefishwildlife.com for more information. And these videos are available at mefishwildlife.com/fieldtrips. And you can also check out mainewildlifepark.com for more information. Thank you everybody and have a great day.